Let me ask you something most people never stop to consider. What if the foods you trust the most, the ones you feel comfortable eating every single day, are the exact ones slowly putting pressure on your kidneys without you ever noticing it? Not fast food, not extreme diets, not obvious mistakes, everyday food. Because this is exactly what shows up again and again when Dr. Kevin Ham reviews patient patterns, especially in people over 60. Everything looks fine on the surface. Energy feels normal. There's no pain, no warning sign, nothing that forces attention. Then a routine test comes back, and something is slightly off. Kidney function is lower than expected, and the reaction is almost always the same. How did this happen? Because nothing felt wrong. Meals seemed balanced. Choices felt reasonable. No clear mistake. No obvious cause. And that's exactly the problem. Kidney decline rarely comes from one bad decision. It comes from small patterns that feel completely safe, repeated quietly every single day over years. Now here's something most people are never told. The kidneys don't send early warnings. They don't create pain. They don't interrupt your day. They don't give you a signal that something is going wrong. Instead, they adapt. They work harder. They compensate silently until one day the numbers change. And by that point, part of the function is already gone. That's why this conversation matters. Not to scare you, not to overwhelm you, but to bring awareness earlier, before those small patterns turn into something permanent. So instead of going through this like a simple list, let's walk through it the way Dr. Kevin Ham explains it during real consultations. Because once one pattern shows up, the others almost always follow. Let's start with something that almost everyone believes is a healthy choice. Fruit juice. Especially the ones labeled natural. No added sugar, fresh, organic. It feels like the right decision. A patient in their early 70s recently described this exact habit. Very disciplined, very careful with diet, completely avoided soda. Every single morning started with a large glass of orange juice. From the outside, it looks perfect. But inside the body, something very different is happening. Fruit juice delivers a concentrated dose of fructose without the fiber that normally slows it down. That means it enters the bloodstream quickly. Blood sugar rises fast. Insulin rises right along with it. Now, when this happens occasionally, the body handles it. But when it happens every single day, that's when the pattern begins. Insulin stays elevated longer than it should. And this is where it directly connects to the kidneys. Elevated insulin sends a signal to the kidneys to retain sodium. When sodium stays in the body, water stays with it. That increases fluid volume. And when fluid volume increases, pressure inside the kidney's filtering system rises. At the same time, fructose metabolism increases uric acid. That affects the small blood vessels inside the kidneys. So now two things are happening together. Pressure is increasing. Blood vessels are under stress. Not enough to notice in a single day, but enough to matter when it repeats every morning, for years. And this is where confusion begins. Because the habit feels right, the intention is good, but the body doesn't respond to labels. It responds to internal chemistry. So now the real question becomes, how many daily habits feel safe, but have never been looked at this way? Because once this pattern becomes clear, something else usually appears right next to it. And this one feels even smaller. So small that most people don't even think about it. A light snack before bed. Something simple. Crackers, toast, maybe a small sandwich, sometimes with cheese. Sometimes something processed. It doesn't feel like a big deal. It doesn't feel like a risk. But this is where the body starts shifting in a way most people never see. At night, the body is preparing to slow down. Hormones begin changing. The kidneys start moving toward a lower filtration state. That's the natural rhythm. But when a late snack contains refined carbohydrates and sodium together, that rhythm gets interrupted. Blood sugar rises, insulin follows, and once again, insulin signals the kidneys to retain sodium. Water stays in the system. Fluid volume increases at a time when the body is supposed to be reducing it. Then a few hours later, something else happens. Blood sugar begins to drop. The body responds by shifting fluid balance again. Now the kidneys increase output. So instead of a smooth transition into rest, the system starts moving back and forth. Retention, then release. Retention, then release. And every time this cycle repeats, it creates extra work for the kidneys during a time when they're supposed to recover. One night won't matter, but a habit repeated hundreds of times absolutely will. Now add another layer. Most of these evening snacks contain hidden sodium, not from a salt shaker, but already built into the food. Bread, cheese, processed spreads. They don't taste overly salty, but the total adds up quickly. So now even more sodium is entering the system, right before the body tries to slow everything down. The result? A mismatch. The kidneys are forced to manage increased fluid at the wrong time, and over time, pressure inside the filtering system rises more often than it should. Let me ask you something honestly. How often does your day end with something small like this? Not a full meal, just something light. Because that small moment, repeated over months and years, becomes a pattern your body has to manage every single night. And once that becomes clear, another pattern usually appears, something even more common, something people rely on to relax. Evening drinks, not large amounts, nothing extreme, just a cup of tea, maybe another, something warm before bed. It feels calming, it feels harmless, but this is where timing becomes more important than most people realize. During the day, the kidneys are designed to actively process fluid. Filtration is higher, output is steady, that's when the system is meant to work. At night, everything slows down. The brain sends signals to reduce urine production so the body can rest. That's how uninterrupted sleep happens. But when fluid intake continues late into the evening, the kidneys are forced to stay active. Now add another detail. Tea contains compounds that act as mild diuretics, coffee even more. So now the body is receiving mixed signals. Slow down for the night, but also process incoming fluid. This creates a mismatch in timing. And when that mismatch repeats night after night, the kidneys stop following a stable rhythm. Instead, they work in bursts. That inconsistency creates stress, not dramatic in one night, but measurable over years. This is why people start noticing something without understanding why, waking up once, then twice, then more often. Most people blame age, bladder issues, prostate changes, but very often, the pattern starts with timing and fluid intake, not the organ itself. And once sleep gets disrupted, everything connects. Recovery drops, hormones shift, blood pressure patterns change, and all of that feeds back into kidney workload. What started as a small habit becomes part of a much larger cycle. Now think about this carefully. How often does your evening include repeated drinks without thinking about timing? Because that small window before sleep is where everything either stabilizes or starts to break. And once that pattern becomes clear, there's another category that builds on top of it. This one doesn't just affect timing, it changes the internal chemistry the kidneys have to deal with. And it's one of the most overlooked habits today. Packaged, ready-made meals. Not fast food, not takeout. Everyday meals from the freezer or fridge, straight into the microwave. They feel practical, controlled, easy. But underneath that convenience, something else is happening. These meals are designed for shelf life and taste consistency, which means higher sodium, more additives, and fewer natural balancing nutrients. So when they become part of a routine, the body is constantly processing higher sodium levels without protection. That increases fluid retention, which increases blood volume, which increases pressure inside the kidneys. But there's another layer most people never see. These foods often contain phosphate additives, highly absorbable, meaning the kidneys have to work harder to regulate mineral balance. So now the kidneys are dealing with pressure and chemical imbalance at the same time. And when this repeats daily, the workload increases quietly, but consistently. Now think about this honestly. How often does convenience replace real food during the week? Because that pattern doesn't show up today, it shows up years later. And by the time it does, it feels like it came out of nowhere. And here's the part most people aren't ready for. Because the next pattern looks like something healthy, something people intentionally choose to improve their body. But instead, it pushes the kidneys even harder in a completely different way. And this is where Dr. Kevin Ham usually pauses and asks one very direct question. What does most of your plate look like every single day? Because the answer to that question leads directly into the next hidden strain. And that's where things start getting serious. When Dr. Kevin Ham asks what your plate looks like every day, the answer usually sounds something like this. Mostly protein, eggs in the morning, chicken or beef for lunch, maybe fish at night, sometimes even protein shakes in between. And on the surface, this sounds like a strong, disciplined, healthy pattern because protein is associated with strength, with recovery, with maintaining muscle, especially after the age of 60. So it rarely gets questioned, but this is where the detail starts to matter more than the intention, because the kidneys are responsible for processing the byproducts of protein metabolism. When protein is broken down, it produces nitrogen waste. That waste has to be filtered out of the blood and excreted. That is a normal function. The system is designed for it. But when protein intake becomes consistently high, something changes. The kidneys respond by increasing filtration rate. This is called hyperfiltration. It means the filtering units are working at a higher pressure than normal to keep up with the increased load. Now here's where the long-term effect begins. That increased pressure, repeated every single day, creates mechanical strain inside the filtering system. Think of it like this. If you run water through a filter at a higher pressure than it was designed for, it still works. It still functions. But over time, the structure begins to wear down. Slowly, silently. That's exactly what happens inside the kidneys. Not damage you feel, not something you notice, but something that builds over years. Now add another layer to this. Animal protein produces a higher acid load compared to plant-based protein. That means the kidneys have to work harder to balance and remove that acid. So now two things are happening at the same time. Increased filtration pressure and increased chemical workload. Again, not harmful in one meal, not even in one day. But when it becomes a daily pattern, the workload becomes constant. And here's where age changes everything. After 60, kidney reserve naturally declines, not as a disease, just as part of normal physiology, which means there is less room for excess, less margin for repeated stress. So patterns that were tolerated easily in younger years begin to have a noticeable effect over time. And this is where people get confused, because they feel like they're doing the right thing. More protein, more strength, better health. But the body doesn't just respond to intention, it responds to balance. So the goal is not to remove protein. That would be the wrong move. The goal is proportion, distribution. How often that load is placed on the system? Let me ask you something directly. How many meals in your week are centered heavily around animal protein? It's without much balance? Not occasionally, as a routine, because that frequency is what determines the outcome. And once that pattern becomes clear, another one usually appears right next to it. This one feels even safer, even more controlled. And it's something people switch to thinking they are making a better choice. Diet drinks, artificially sweetened beverages, no sugar, no calories, no problem, right? That's the assumption, and it feels logical. If sugar creates issues, removing sugar should solve them. But the body doesn't always work that simply. Because even without sugar, these drinks still interact with the body in ways that are easy to overlook. When something tastes sweet, the brain prepares for glucose. That signal alone can influence insulin activity, even if no real sugar is present. Now imagine that happening multiple times a day, every day, over years. The system starts adapting. Insulin sensitivity begins to shift. Not exactly like sugar, but not neutral either. Now add another layer. Artificial sweeteners affect the gut microbiome. That internal system plays a major role in metabolism, inflammation, and how the body processes nutrients. When that balance shifts, the effects don't stay in the gut. They move outward. Blood sugar regulation changes, inflammation patterns shift, and all of that eventually reaches the kidneys. Because the kidneys filter whatever is circulating in the bloodstream, they adapt to whatever internal environment is being created.